nunca supe que había cosas así. Nunca supe o sabía que había cosas así.
All right. Well, sorry to be running just a little bit late like this. Sometimes another class. When they're right before, it's kind of hard to find things sometimes. Anyway, so how is everybody? Did you enjoy thinking about? That's one of my little hopes, you know, as a professor who writes these bizarre little. I think I'm getting better at writing bizarre little fact patterns. I tried to make it real simple this time, you know, just $10 million economic consequences. Then there are these other ecological consequences that are kind of cool, you know, that many environmentalists want to promote. So go for it, you know, figure it all out. Tell me what a group A. They're not really Leopoldians at all, right? What a group A anti-Leopoldian, what a group A Pinchoian conservationists would say, and what a group B would say. And what a wise use would say, you know. I guess you could have written the whole exam without considering either wise use or one of those two, right? You could have just thrown out wise use, but I figured wise use is kind of like that, I don't know, one of those super energy drinks, you know. It's got that huge charge of metaphysical righteousness in it, you know. Anyway, so that's kind of fun to work with that, and then all the rest of it's very similar, of course. You know, well, that teleological argument though is one that the utilitarians and the conservationists, the group A's and the group B's, would of course just tell the wise users to get rid of their exotic metaphysical commitments and just stick with the mechanistic universe and efficiency and all that. Anyway, today is our day to just kind of take a breather, I guess, maybe. And take a step back and do some remedial work, perhaps. Keep in mind the three guiding questions, all right? And the one is, I want to say it, in some important ways, is the most attractive for a scientifically minded person who's really curious about digging into this Darwinian claim about the origin of moral norms. You know, the originary question, I think, draws a lot of attention. But it turns out that you know, and in many ways, I keep trying to. I think that's largely an empirical. It's weird though when I say that's an empirical inquiry. It's kind of a bizarre kind of empirical inquiry because. The neo-Kantians want to say, well, it's not really an empirical inquiry at all. But they're both making different kinds of important empirical claims, right? And saying certain empirical claims are really important, which is a hallmark of Enlightenment thinking, right? But the three questions are, and I want to say the axiological question is the most important. And that's the one that sets off environmental ethics from all other kinds of moral philosophical inquiries that you take in a Western university, right? We get into that heavy-duty metaethics, right? The axiological question, what has moral status? Now, maybe a misguided question, when we get down the road a little farther, we may learn that, in fact, it's not that great of a question. It's a good question. It's one that helps us explore a certain approach to environmental ethics that's had a lot of influence over the years. And over the decades. But anyway, the axiological importance question is really important, and it's the one I break this down the way that William James breaks it down, who's one of my philosophical mentors, probably the most important one, leading American philosopher, right? 1842 to 1910. American pragmatist, you know, probably the principal leading exponent of American pragmatist school of philosophy. And anyway, he, in his famous essay, The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life, he defines moral philosophy as being circumscribed. You know, moral philosophy is the pursuit of these three different questions, the answers to these three different types of questions, right? And he identifies them in The Moral Philosopher and the Moral Life. He identifies them as let me see if I get this right. He doesn't use the terms I'm using because I'm trying to narrow down his basic approach to, I'm trying to narrow it down to environmental ethics. But I'm pretty sure he calls the what we're calling the axiological question, I'm pretty sure he calls that the metaphysical question, and then he calls the originary question, he calls that the psychological question, the psychological evolutionary question. And he does point out, as I just got through pointing out a couple minutes ago, that that's the most popular, that's the one that the more people, who haven't studied philosophy tend to latch onto that one, think that's the most important one. We can just explain, the origin, what is the purpose? For what purpose did moral norms evolve? If we can just answer that question, then we're good to go, right? We don't need to do any of this metaphysics, and we don't need to do even any of this normative. Well, we just always need to do that, I guess. Anyway, but James divides our work up into the work of the moral philosopher up into pursuit of the metaphysical question, pursuit of the psychological question, and pursuit of he calls it the casuistic question, but really, and casuistic means case by case. And really, I think what he's getting at, though, is what we're calling, and what most philosophers would call the normative question, right? So all the elements are there. We just kind of, in James's definition of how we go, of how to do moral philosophy, what we're doing in this class, and I want you all to keep an eye on those three questions, right? And I've already offered a tantalizing hint that perhaps is inspiring to some budding young philosophers, This notion that the standard Darwinian answer to the originary question perhaps commits us to, on the normative side, right? It commits us to a consequentialist. We can't be non-consequentialists, right? It seems, although don't take my word for all of this. These are all invitations perhaps to do philosophy. My answers aren't necessarily the right ones. But we're trying to crack open the questions, right? And that's our main objective in this class. Because the questions, there is enlightenment in questions, in understanding the questions, right? Digging into them. And the answers, right? Are the Humeans right or the Kantians right? We'll never know, right? This debate's been going on already for 300 years, so one would expect it to continue for quite a while longer, and probably it's not really resolvable. Because they're both right, there is something there's something very important about the neo-Humean claim that moral norms are predicated on feelings, right? Feelings of approval and disapproval that are somehow encoded in our cultures, right, in our society. And then the neo-Kantians say that no, feelings are never an adequate compass, and that reason we need that the moral norms can only be articulated, identified through the use of reason, and that feelings, in fact, are a distraction for the neo-Kantians. But anyway, so today is our day to kind of step back and just keep those three questions in mind, all right? As we go through the rest of the term, we are going to focus in on the axiological question, which James calls the metaphysical question. We're going to focus in on the normative question a lot today, and go over once again this very important distinction between consequentialist normative theories and non-consequentialist. We're launching out into kind of not yet really, no, not yet. But we're moving in that direction, in the direction of non-consequentialist environmental ethics, resource management ethics. All right, but so far, we're just going to read Leopold as a consequentialist, and that's how Kolika, our next author, I believe that's right. We're reading Kolika, and then we're reading Milstein. And that those are kind of bookends. Milstein interprets Leopold more like a neo-Kantian, turns Leopold into more of a neo-Kantian. Whereas Kolika, who has been the most influential interpreter of Leopold, by far, he kind of laid down, the sort of almost the consensus interpretation, which now is very much in question, by the way. But for 20 years or so there, Kolika's interpretation of Leopold as a Humean, right? This whole Hume, Smith, Darwin, consequentialist, anthropocentric, right? Ultimately, but Kolika, this is the fascination of his work, and perhaps where the source of all his errors lie, because he wants to insist that he wants to also be a more than anthropocentrist, right? But he wants to get through consequential, and he wants to cling to both his Darwinian answer to the originary question, and he wants to cling to his more than anthropocentric answer to the axiological question. There's a little introduction to Kolika, kind of a wordy and sophisticated. Maybe some of you, hopefully most of you caught all that. But as you'll see, that may be the fatal flaw, right? Collicutt remains a Darwinian through and through, but he's trying to defend this non-consequentialist set of reasons for why we should protect ecological wholes, right? Non-consequentialist reasons for why we should protect ecological wholes. He wants to defend the idea that ecological wholes, including species, climate systems, a whole range of different, wildlife communities, right, plant communities, etc. So those are all ecological wholes. He wants to say they have value in and of themselves, right? And in his other work, he kind of fudges between using the word intrinsic and using the word inherent, and he kind of settles and insists on using the word inherent finally. But for our purposes, for our limited purposes, he's trying to defend this basic claim that ecological wholes have value in and of themselves, are value, and therefore he has to be classified as a more than anthropocentrist, right? Because he wants to say they are claimants to moral status in direct, right? Direct, not just indirectly because the climate system, we have to keep that working pretty well just for us, right? No, he wants to say that ecological whole has independent, direct moral status, right? That's a bedrock claim that Collicutt's going to defend all the way to the bitter end, okay? So, but he's also wants to defend his essentially Darwinian consequentialist interpretation of Leopold and construction of the land ethic, right? So Collicutt thinks he's offering us an unenvironmental ethic, a comprehensive Leopoldian land ethic, right? Which is going to give land managers guidance on how to proceed in some of these very difficult questions, all right? Anyway, so we're going to step back, I guess, for the time being and just think about the metaphysics, think about the axiological question, right? And more broadly, stepping back from all this anthropocentric versus more than anthropocentric language, you could step back even farther back and think about it from the perspective of subjectivist metaethic versus an object, right? An anthropocentrist is clearly oriented more toward the subjectivist side, right? A non-anthropocentrist or a more than anthropocentrist, if that's your answer, if you say climate systems, for example, or species, genetic lineages, have intrinsic value and therefore have direct moral status, if that's your claim, then you're saying we have obligations to defend those things, and it doesn't matter whether, obviously it's true that the consequences of protecting the climate are really good for us, but our reasons for protecting climate systems are not necessarily dependent on consequence. In fact, the moral quality of what we do with respect to our climate doesn't weigh on consequences. It weighs on whether or not we have instrumentalized, right? That's what the non-consequentialist says. That's the neo-Kantian answer, right? Remember, there is this neo-Kantian moment, which we'll get to next week when we read Milstein, right? Milstein has this neo-Kantian interpretation of Leopold Collicutt's interpretation, which we're reading for Thursday, which I'm not asking you to summarize. In fact, I'm not asking you to summarize Milstein's essay either, but I am asking you to, so heads up, I am asking you to summarize Christopher Stone's landmark essay, published in 1972, I believe. Right? That's one of those big classics, right? Some of the pieces that we read are just these towering classics, and then in between the towering classics, we've got all these kind of academic papers, right? And we'll get to a whole string of those, written by professional philosophers. But Stone actually is a professional lawyer and a professional law professor. And he wrote, as a young law professor at UCLA in Southern California, he wrote this famous essay, which was cited by one of the Supreme Court justices in a very famous case, an environmental law case called Sierra Club versus Morton. But we'll read that essay in which he makes the very provocative argument that in answer to his question, really his question is a little bit misleading because what he's really wanting, the title of his essay ought to be, Should Forests Have Standing? Because he's not interested, his theory isn't really interested in individual trees. He's not going to say that. Unless it's some super special, really old tree or some tree that houses a whole ecosystem or something, I suppose then. But really, he's interested in standing up for the rights of ecological wholes, which is our question right at this stage, which is why we're reading Christopher Stone's famous essay. Because he wants to defend the claim that ecological wholes should be respected as having legal status and the right to bring lawsuits on their own behalf. Okay? I told you, it's a very provocative argument. How can that be? How could a forest bring a lawsuit on its own behalf? That's crazy, right? Well, he has this whole guardianship system, which is really quite simple and really kind of a neat system that he devises. But he envisions a dramatic expansion of our civil court system, which would provide for greatly expanded opportunities because the system would be available to. It wouldn't be expensive. It would be more well funded by our government, and that system would also incorporate a guardianship system whereby people who really care, for example, about an old-growth forest nearby, or a salmon run, or an endangered species, can bring suit. He's writing this before the Endangered Species Act, by the way. So in some ways, the Endangered Species Act solves some of these problems that he thinks his proposal would solve. But anyway, that's where we're going with Stone. And Stone doesn't make it clear, and this is what's so interesting. Part of what's so interesting about his essay from a moral philosophy point of view. He doesn't make it clear whether or not he believes. Is he defending the claim that they actually have moral? They've had it all along. We've just been too dumb to recognize it, right? And now we recognize it, and now they have legal status, right, according to Stone's argument. Is that what he's saying? They have, now we're smart enough because we've been educated by ecologists and biologists. We're smart enough, enlightened enough to recognize that, well, they've had moral status the whole time. And so now we're going to adjust our legal system to give them legal status, right? Or is Stone saying something really quite different and less exotic and maybe easier to swallow for the average American, shall we say? Is he just saying that it's in our interests, our long-term human interests, to expand our the legal franchise, to treat ecological wholes as though, right? There's those words again. What does that remind you of? As though they have legal standing. Who wrote like that, talked like that we kind of encountered already? I'm thinking of Brian Norton. Brian Norton would be a guy that says, no, we don't know whether or not an ecological whole has any special metaphysical or moral status, right? That would be a bizarre kind of claim to make, that we know that, right? Well, we can never know that. But we can know through our consequentialist analysis, with help from ecologists and biologists, we can know that the long-term consequences of treating those ecological wholes as though they have moral status is better for us in the long term, right? So Stone could be making either one of those claims, right? The first claim has metaphysical teeth in it, right? The first claim, they have status, they have moral status, they've had it all along, we've just been too ignorant to recognize it. Now we're smart enough to recognize it, and our legal system has to adapt, right? That would be a very strong kind of argument, right? The weaker kind of argument is just, well, it's in our interest, right? The prudential argument, long term. And that would be Norton's argument, right? If we take into account future generations and all that they are going to need to live healthy lives, then we have to recognize that treating climate systems and forests and rivers and salmon runs and all the components of healthy ecosystems on planet Earth as though they have independent moral status is the prudent course of action, right? That's the prudent way to guide our management, right? Our resource policy, okay? So anyway, and we'll be chasing around, right? And it's kind of an odd question to ask, right? Because on one hand, the people who want to make that first kind of answer, this really strong answer, that ecological wholes, they just have moral status, all right? That's a very strong claim, right? And yet it seems to be the claim that most radical environmentalists are committed to defending in one way or another. And that's kind of how we set up this next part of our journey through environmental ethics, right? Now we're trying to get more specific. We're trying to zero in on this aspect of the radical environmentalist meta-ethics, shall we say, right? Because it seems to me most radical environmentalists are making that first, stronger kind of claim, right? Whereas guys like Wilson, Norton, and Baxter, right, are all saying that to the extent that we can defend radical environmental policies, which they all want to do, right? The policies they want to defend are just as radical as the ones that the Earth Firsters, the super radicals, want to defend, right? But they say that prudentially the best way to defend those policies is with reference. And then remember the convergence hypothesis. I don't think we read any place where Norton actually, but that's his term, right? And that kind of rounds out for you Norton. Norton's not that hard to understand, right? The way he constructs this environmental ethic, which he thinks is ready-made for a resource manager to use, right? He views the work of an environmental philosopher as going up and doing research in libraries and hanging out in an ivory tower office and teaching classes for many years, and eventually putting together a set of procedures, moral norms, and other ways of thinking about natural resources that the natural resource manager can then use. And so for Norton being really interested in influencing policy, he's just very partial to an anthropocentric kind of argument. Now, as far as his meta-ethical commitments go, his metaphysics go, to be fair to him, he's not committing us. He's not committing himself to a strictly anthropocentric axiology, right? He's really just saying that practically that's the best answer to the axiological question, right? What has moral status? The whole human community. And by that he means long-term, future generations as well, right? The whole ongoing cycle of human life on planet Earth. Okay? That's what has ultimate moral, right? Practically speaking, that's the entity around which we would be best advised to organize our resource policies, right? That's as far as Norton wants to go with his claims, and he would just say, as far as the metaphysical, these axiological questions, I don't know the answer to those because you have to go beyond experience in order to answer them. And there are different ways of going beyond experience, but that's really just people offer us one way of going beyond experience. And perhaps others, but I would rather not make any kind of questionable metaphysical commitments, right? That's Norton. I'm being Norton right there, right? That's what he's saying in the end. He doesn't want to make any questionable metaphysical commitments, and he believes, right? And this is his convergence hypothesis. He believes that at a practical level, environmental policies that are organized around the long-term welfare of human communities are going to be just as effective as policies practically on the ground. They're going to produce the same beneficial results that, for example, a John Muir or a non-consequentialist Leopoldian might have it, right? The convergence, and you can't help but notice he's kind of right about that. That it does seem to be an important point. But in an environmental ethics class, we're not as strongly interested in policy. We keep an eye on that, right? And we kind of nod our hats to Norton and his paying attention to that, right? But we're also interested in reading, analyzing these other claims that an objectivist might make, about how they're just more right. Sure, there are these consequences, and that's a good argument, right? They would never deny that those are good arguments. Those are part of our, of any intelligent person's set of responses when challenged on why they are environmentalists, right? But ultimately, the real reasons, right? The neo-Kantians want to say, which is kind of where we're going. The real reasons we want to protect the environment are because these natural resources have value in themselves, right? And not just for long-term human interests, all right? Anyway, so these are some broad meta-ethical questions that a resource manager has to consider because, what's interesting is that it does turn out, that I've mentioned this before, is that natural resource management questions, they seem simple, right? And you decide them on the ground, and you don't use fancy language when you're out there in the forest, right? Wearing your Smokey Bear hat and you're solving practical on-the-ground problems. But it turns out that to adequately address all the different aspects of these problems that you might address if you were a Smokey Bear, you work for the Forest Service, you would have to ask questions that are among the most profound questions that humans ever get a chance to consider, right? These are the kind of questions we're asking, and I submit that they are very important. And if you want to be a resource manager, then you have to have some familiarity with the different ways that we might go about answering these questions, right? In other societies, these questions would be taken up by, by mystics and wise men and medicine men, right? People would go sitting up on a mountain for 4 days without food and water to think about these questions, right? And that's kind of a function of philosophy, right? So we're kind of keeping that alive. Keeping that alive, that idea that there is a way to mediate correctly with the more than human world, right? There's a way to interact correctly with the more than human world, and we have to seek out guidance from the wise people in our community to answer that question. And to answer that question, what is the wise way of relating to non-human living beings? We have to know about their moral status, right? Just when we to know how wisely to interact with one another, we have to know about one another's moral status. So, and as we go down here, it becomes increasingly more puzzling to figure out how you would even go about answering these questions. Right? For a non-human living being like a dog, there's somebody there's a personality there are sets of preferences that we can observe, and it's quite easy to, right? We understand the moral status of an individual. And then the moral status of a plant, that's also fairly easy to understand. Right? But when we get up to a community level, when we get up to an ecosystem level, especially if we do these weird things like I do, like isolate, to talk about the climate system, right? What is the moral status of a climate system? Most people just want to say, well, however it relates to us, why even bother thinking about it as its own independent thing, right? But it seems to me that perhaps that's something that's called for. Think about climate systems as being members of our community, right? With the moral status. Isn't that what Leopoldians would say? Isn't that what they're inclined to say? Right? They're not just talking about species. They're also talking about the systemic features of the biota community, like the climate system. Right? Anyway, so in review, there are two components of an environmental ethic: an axiological orientation, the first question of resource management ethics, and the second question, of course, is the normative question, and that answers that is the second essential component, right? And then along the way, we kind of observe what these different authors are saying or implying about the origins, what generates moral norms, where do moral norms come from, right? And essentially, in a nutshell, neo-Kantians are insisting that there is a cultural component to the generation of moral norms, that the moral norms cannot possibly be reduced to sentiments and biology, okay? So from the neo-Kantian standpoint, the most onerous and foul-smelling philosophy we've encountered so far is this sociobiology, right? Even though E.O. Wilson might, find all kinds of alliances with radical environmentalists, his portrayal of how moral norms emerge is just deeply, deeply flawed, according to the neo-Kantians, right? Because the neo-Kantians insist that to understand moral norms, we have to recognize that they are shaped by culture and the use of reason, right? Which only humans have access to. Okay, so that's what separates the neo-Kantian view. One big separation between the neo-Kantians and the neo-Humeans. The neo-Humeans are perfectly happy to identify every last feature of morality as being accountable through biology, through genetics, right? Which means ultimately, somehow selfishly, right? Somehow, if not selfishly in this body, my little community, right? Selfishly for that. And then the neo-Kantians want to say, no, emotions and sentiment are totally unreliable and they have nothing to do with the articulation of duty. Deon is the Greek word for duty, so deontology really means the study of duty. And duty is never based on feeling, right? Feeling is just something that goes with culture and with how you feel that day, and that changes, right? And so you can't possibly identify a moral norm through feeling, is what the neo-Kantians say. And a moral norm is identified through the use of reason, which is a feature of human culture, right? And so, so moral norms emerge through both, right? Through both genetically, biologically, and culturally, okay? And that cultural, and so the Kantians are happy to identify these deep and very important distinctions between the human animal and all other animals, okay? And that might make some of you nervous, right? it might take us away, right? It might reintroduce some kind of duality, and that's a legitimate skepticism. That's something to be concerned about. I'm concerned about that too. You know, and from that perspective, right, the Humeans and the you know the Humeans and the Darwinists seem to have, right. I mean, if one of our goals, if one cultural benefit of ecology is to recognize is to bring human beings to understand their continuity with the animal world, right? That we're not radically different. We have all these same characteristics, right? All these same features. We are animals, right? That's a good insight that people ought to absorb, right? Perhaps, right? If you're an environmentalist, that's certainly one thing you might believe. That the more we come to accept our animality, the more respectful our relationships with the other animals are going to be, right? And so, if you interpret the emergence of moral norms genetically and evolutionarily, the way the Humeans and the Neo-Humeans and the Darwinists want to do, then hey, that keeps us nice and consistent and, you know, we're right in line with the animals. And that may be an attractive outcome or feature of that approach, right? But anyway, but it also might not account for everything that's going on, right? And you might have trouble, as a Neo-Humean, you might have trouble explaining how a non-human entity like a climate system might have independent moral status, right? You might have a lot of trouble doing that, because for a Darwinian, moral norms emerge to benefit us, right? So they can't be centered on something over there that is not, you know, right? Just because now we're enlightened, right? Anyway, so, but keep in mind that all this axiological stuff, right, that was on this previous slide here, I've got it kind of broken down for you, right? And it would probably be fair to call Brian Norton, right? He adopts this for pragmatic reasons. He adopts this point of view for pragmatic reasons, but he really doesn't want to answer the question about whether or not there might be moral status happening over here, right? So, and I think the same can be said for the social ecologists and the ecofeminists, and really all these guys they should be considered more strategic, right? They're anthropocentric as resource managers, because that's just how they have to be, because they're human beings as resource managers, and they have to think about their fellow community members who are all human beings. But what Norton's point is that if you include properly, right? If you properly include future generations, and he has other arguments that, he argues that there's no way to consider the human community without all part of the human community is future generations. Okay? That's really what all these other orientations are arguing. These are just different right? These are different environmental ethics that have basically accepted this axiological orientation. Okay? But we would not be studying these really difficult questions, right? If we were just doing regular, like if we were doing ethics of life and death, or youth, and you study things like abortion and euthanasia, right? All these deep human quandaries that we sometimes find ourselves in, right? That maybe an ethicist can contribute an answer to, right?